Hi there, speaking with you today about race relations in Cuba. Like other countries in the Caribbean, Cuba had experienced slavery while it was a colony of the Spanish. So that was a huge part of their history with the slavery. And the Spanish crown did not abolish slavery in Cuba until 1886. Once Cuba got its independence, recognized by the United States in 1902, their independence from Spain. There still was quite a bit of European, but certainly more American influence by then, and carrying into the 20th century. But one of the major periods that changes a lot of race relations in Cuba is the Cuban Revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power in 1959. There were some good and bad things that came from this overall in terms of race relations. In terms of what was positive for black Cubans is that Fidel and this new government in 1959 and in the following years after that, they did eliminate most of the most blatant forms of discrimination, government-sanctioned discrimination. They opened some of the beaches and parks to black Cubans. They eliminated the most egregious examples of discrimination in schools and other places. They also opposed apartheid in South Africa, very vehemently opposed apartheid in South Africa. They opposed racial segregation in the United States. So there certainly were good things that came from this, and this is why the political scientist Mark Sawyer calls the Cuban Revolution that brought Castro to power really a watershed moment in the history of race relations in Cuba. However, there is a bad side to this as well. One of the things that Fidel Castro did is he banned any sort of race consciousness groups. Okay, so if you think like in America, that might be the NAACP or other groups, in the 60s or something like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, those types of groups. But in Cuba, those were banned. So anyone that was explicitly addressing race issues, these groups were banned. And any challenge to the government was brutally suppressed. Now, this was the case in many aspects of Cuban life and society, not just in terms of race relations, but any sort of challenge to the government on these policies was going to be repressed brutally. There are examples of this. There's a biography by Carlos Moore. This is a man who grew up in Cuba, grew up in Batista's Cuba, and this is prior to Castro coming to power. His family moved to the United States when that happened, but he eventually returned. So this is a black man from Cuba that went to the United States with his family, but then returned back to Cuba. And he found that when he was applying for different jobs with these sort of institutions, these bureaucracies that were placing people in jobs, he found that there still was racism. So what he decided to do is go to the head of the army. Now, the head of the army, Juan Almeida in Cuba, is one of the very few members of Castro's upper parts of his government. So he goes to Juan Almeida, does Carlos Moore. He goes to Juan Almeida and basically says, there's still racism in the government in Cuba, and we need to fix this. And Juan Almeida's response, listening carefully, was basically, you better shut up unless you want to end up in front of a firing squad. And eventually Carlos Moore was arrested. And so for a period, and this just shows that even though Castro was making public efforts to change things or race relations, that any sort of challenges to what still was the permeating racism in Cuba were going to be squashed. And so in the next video, we'll talk about some of the connections between race relations in Cuba and the United States. Until then.